Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 185 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions. Advanced Compliance Solutions is offering my first FCPA Masterclass training, which will be held in Houston next month on September 10th and 11th. If you have ever wanted to know about how the nuts and bolts of compliance works, or the doing of compliance through compliance program implementation or enhancement, this is the course for you. So I hope you will consider coming to the class. You can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com for more information. Today you're in for a real treat because I have Chris Sindik. Chris is with the Red Flag Group, and he did an exhaustive study of third-party supplier codes of conduct. I think you'll find this very interesting. The episode comes in at just over 34 minutes. Thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. You're in for a real treat today. It's going to be informative and information I think that you can really use to incorporate in your compliance program, but more importantly, that really move your compliance program forward. And I'm all about moving the ball of compliance forward. So with that introduction, I have Chris Sindik. Chris is an advisor with the Red Flag Group, and I saw a presentation that Chris made at the Greater Houston Business and Ethics Roundtable July event about supplier codes of conduct. Chris has done just an incredibly detailed and fabulous job of looking at those, and I asked him after his presentation if he could visit with me and share some of his thoughts about my audience. So that's somewhat long-winded introduction. Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time from your schedule to visit with us today.
Sure, Tom. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation. Really happy to be speaking with you and your listenership today.
Chris, could you maybe describe what you do with the Red Flag Group? But then more importantly, I want you to really detail for people what you did on this project, because just by describing it, I think it really lends itself, the description will lend itself to some of the analysis you're going to get into, because I think you just did a fabulous job. So tell us about what you do with Red Flag Group and how you came to this project.
Sure. Yeah, with the Red Flag Group, I'm really doing a lot of projects over there. Certainly, one of my main focus is on codes of conduct, be it an employee code or a supplier code, working on policies or so there are other compliance policies and procedures, things like that. Doing a lot of work with our technology right now, doing some third-party audits and questionnaire building. Really anything that needs to be done, I'm always happy to jump on a project there. But yeah, we're staying real busy over there these days. So I'm getting pulled into a lot of different projects there, which is really exciting. It's something new every day at a new client, and it's a very good field to be in. But to talk a little bit more specifically about the work that I did on supplier codes. What we did was, just not too terribly long ago, we did an examination of 150 supplier codes of conduct, and not just any supplier codes of conduct, but we really wanted to focus on the largest, biggest, most widely known companies out there, and focusing on their supplier codes. And really the rationale was behind that is that we wanted the best that were out there. And typically, the largest companies that we all know and love, they're going to have a little bit more resources and motivation to actually construct a quality supplier code. We find that a lot of times in the employee code world as well, so we expected the same there. So we went down the list of the largest companies in the world and see if we could find a supplier code that was publicly available. And if we did, we sort of put it aside, and we knew that we would examine it at a later date. So I think to find 150 different supplier codes, we probably had to look at about 700 different companies. So it wasn't terribly popular for companies to have their supplier code made available to the public. It could be the case that many of these organizations have their code on their intranet, just not made public for some reason. So, we really went through and it took quite an effort to just locate these codes to start with, and then once we had located them, put them through a pretty rigorous methodology, a consistent methodology to kind of examine some strengths, some weaknesses, some trends, and some gaps as well.
Chris, you hit on something I wanted to follow up with, you touched on something rather, which is I think most folks are certainly familiar with employee codes of conduct. You maybe they may not be not as familiar with supplier codes of conduct. Could you detail what you saw or what you see as kind of the key differences in an employee code of conduct versus a supplier code of conduct?
Right, and there are quite a lot of differences between an employee and a supplier code, and I should sort of qualify what I mean by supplier code. That's kind of just what I've come to call it, just by kind of labeling them as supplier codes, but they can also be known as a business partner code of conduct, or a third-party code of conduct, or code of ethics, code of business standards, something like that. But really, a rose by any other name is still a rose. What that is kind of a set of standards and guidelines that are used for third parties, whether it's suppliers, distributors, agents, anyone in that sort of third party bucket. And really, I think that pretty much everyone is familiar with employee codes these days. There's legal requirements out there for companies to have an employee code, not so much with supplier codes. So really the differences between an employee code and a supplier code come down to sort of three main areas. One is the audience. With the employee code, you know your audience. You know who your workers are. You know exactly how many of them there are, more or less, and what areas they're operating in and which locations and what they're doing, basically. With a supplier code, it could be a company that's based in Australia or China or Brazil or, Latvia. You just don't know, so you really have to deal with that unknown element in the code. So that's a key difference. You don't really know your audience as well with the supplier code. The function, too, it's a little bit different. I think with the employee code, kind of the hallmark of that and the goal of that is to create a common culture and a unifying set of standards for employees. With the supplier code, it's a little bit more of a hardline stance as opposed to creating a common culture. I think it's a little bit more of mitigation, hardline rules, and really trying to alert the company to possible misconduct and trying to control the suppliers as well. And then lastly, kind of a big difference that I saw between the employee code and the supplier code is definitely the length. Employee codes, typically they're maybe around 30 pages long when there's a design and presentation. They look really good. With the supplier code, maybe it's going to be about 7 pages. Typically about a quarter of the length of the employee code. So really, they serve sort of the same purpose in some ways, but in the same way they don't. Really a difference in audience there, and that really needs to be reflected in the way they're constructed.
Chris, did you come up with or observe any consistent characteristics of sort of the top supplier codes you looked at?
Sure. Yeah, definitely after looking at 150 codes, there were some pretty hallmark areas that stood out for the top 10 codes that we examined. And I should point out, too, that all this is available in a white paper that's free to download. If you go to the Red Flag Group's website, redflaggroup.com, you can kind of click around and find a link to the white paper. And again, it's a free thing that people can really get some detailed information on this subject. But in looking at sort of the areas that were consistently well done for the top 10 codes, or sort of the top tier codes that we looked at, some of these are kind of common sense things, but things that we saw. One of which is really just having a clear explanation of the rules, expectations, and risk topics that suppliers need to know about. This is sort of elementary. If I were to pick sort of one priority or the first priority, it would be to just have the information in there that people are going to need to know about. So the top codes that we saw, they really covered the most important areas in appropriate depth. I think that the next natural step from that is that letting people know where to go if they suspect misconduct, or maybe they're just not sure exactly what to do. So having some reporting avenues actually in the code itself that people can utilize. These are suppliers suppliers that may be all over the world. If they see a bribe or something like that, they should be able to report it. And unfortunately, in 30% of the codes that I did look at, there was nothing at all. No phone number or email address or website for people to take that next step and make a report. So having some of those clear reporting avenues makes a code really a document of action. Next is just having everything written in a language that's easy to understand. You want people to be able to understand what's there. And two, I think that the supplier code has to stand on its own 2 feet. There aren't a lot of other systems in place, or there isn't much as control around the supplier code as there is around an employee code. So you have to talk about the need for monitoring and enforcement of the code as well. And then lastly, one of the things that really stood out, kind of a really easy way sometimes to identify a supplier code that a lot of effort went into, is the presentation and design. A lot of codes that had all those other elements that I just mentioned, they typically looked really good as well. Having branded photographs, anything that shows off the company's products and global presence as well. So those were a lot of the things that sort of stood out consistently with the top codes that we looked at.
And then we're able to come up with some suggested or proposed best practices based upon your analysis people might be able to use going forward.
Definitely. And sort of the approach that we took in examining these codes was to kind of come up with around 8 different areas that we looked at. And within each one of those 8 areas, we kind of identified some best practices. One of the areas that sort of naturally presented itself as we started this project was the accessibility of the code. Just how easy it was to find online. Is it in a logical place on the website, or did you have to sort of do a Google search and dig really deep and sometimes go into a foreign language and translate a page to find the supplier code? So really the code, the supplier code, I would recommend having it right next to the employee code on the website. I think it makes sense to have those right alongside each other. Oftentimes, too, larger companies will have sort of a section of their website devoted to supplier relations, supplier diversity, kind of a supplier manual, something like that. So really just having it in an area of the code or an area of the website that people are going to logically look at when they want to know a little bit more about the supply chain transparency, the ethics of the company, corporate governance, something like that. So really just having the code in an area that people can easily find. And two, having it in a format that's portable and accessible. PDF is really the best way to go.
What about leadership and visibility and values?
Sure. That's something that I think most people are pretty familiar with. And again, referring to the employee codes, pretty much the first page of the employee code when you look at it is a letter from the CEO, president, chairperson of the board, founder, something like that. And really, we would expect to see something similar in the supplier code as well. It is recommended to have sort of the top level management, a CEO, president, someone like that, put their stamp of approval on the supplier code. I think that's really a strong message. It shows to the readership, to the suppliers that are looking at the code, that this is a document that matters. It's not just some other policy. It's something that is important to the CEO, and therefore it should be important to you. And unfortunately, when we looked at the codes, only about 20% had any sort of letter or message from a senior level executive. So over 80% just didn't really have any sort of endorsement from leadership in the code. And luckily this can be one of the easier things to change. Just including a short letter, 2-3 paragraphs talking about why the code's important, who it applies to, where someone can go for help. I think that's an important message to include in the code.
I think one of the big banes in codes that has evolved over the years is evolved in a positive way is putting in language so people understand the code. Mm-hmm. When I started back in 2004, it was written by lawyers. There was 4 lawyers, and that was pretty much it. But we're way beyond that. But as you put it out with your suppliers, you may not even know who's going to be reading it, or maybe a group of people that you haven't thought through as part of your audience. So what do you recommend in terms of language so that the code is understandable, or how would you even think through that issue?
Right. And you kind of took the words out of my mouth when you said that codes used to be written by lawyers for lawyers. And, nothing against lawyers. My sister's a lawyer. But, sometimes that writing style, you need to make it a little bit more streamlined and a little bit easier to understand. Kind of a function that most people can utilize when they do a spell check. Sometimes you can see the grade level at the end of that sort of gives a good indication of the years of education someone would need to fully understand the code. And really the code should be written at no higher than the reading level of a senior in high school. And codes, they can be lower than that. I think the lowest that we examined was at around the 10th grade reading level, which I think would be a sophomore in high school. And getting anything below that just really isn't realistic with the concepts that need to be in the code, with the vocabulary that's in there. Shooting for the 10th, 11th, 12th grade reading level is realistic. Anything below that is really not going to be a realistic goal. And really the reason why we recommend that is because, again, you don't know who your exact readership is going to be. And especially if you're translating the code as well. You want a document that's sort of straightforward, easy to understand, and easy to comprehend too. So definitely want something that people can read once and understand. They can move through quickly. If something's complexly written, it can be a bit more difficult to kind of make sense, make heads or tails of the code. And kind of relating that back to the study that we did, only about 20% of the codes that we looked at, that's kind of the magic number, it seems, that only 20% of the codes that we looked at were actually in that recommended grade level range. All of them were higher, none of them were lower. I think that the kind of average grade level across those 150 codes was at about the 16th or the 15th grade level. So someone would more or less need a college degree to fully understand some of the documents that were out there.
I see the next question really is related to the last topic of how do you understand the code, because when you have a group of people, known and unknown, you're going to have a variety of risks, both known and unknown. So how do you advocate companies take a look at risk topics that they should discuss in their code?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if a company is asking themselves, what risks should we cover in our supplier code of conduct, a lot of times that answer should be known already. If the company is having a little bit of difficulty with determining what those are, I would recommend that they do a risk assessment. I think that's always a worthwhile exercise to do. But I think that as a baseline, there are typically about a dozen or so risk areas that should be covered universally in supplier codes of conduct. Really regardless of the industry or the scope of the operations, I again think that there are some baseline areas that should be covered in a supplier code. Typically it's things like human rights, workplace safety, discrimination, bribery and corruption, conflict of interest, data privacy, so on and so forth. I think that those are the areas that can get companies into trouble. A lot of times, if there is some misconduct on behalf of a supplier, distributor, reseller, agent, that can really get the company, the hiring company, into hot water. So I think those are worthwhile to cover. And I think that too there is an intrinsic good in constructing a supplier code that addresses things like human rights and forced labor and child labor and safe working conditions, things like that. Those are sort of real areas that companies have had to face lately. We've kind of seen some headlines about some major company suppliers maybe not doing the things that they should be doing, and I think that companies do have a responsibility to address those, and certainly the supplier code is just one part of that, but I think that those areas are worthwhile to cover in the code. And in looking at kind of what we found in our assessment, again, of the risk topics that were covered in the code, the three that were covered most commonly were human rights, which includes sort of working conditions, wage and hour rules, forced labor, child labor, things like that. That was covered in nearly 9 out of 10 codes. So while that's good, at the same time, 10% of codes didn't cover that at all. Next, shortly behind that was environmental compliance. Typically, this is pollution, waste, chemical usage, sometimes things like that. And then number 3 on that list was workplace safety and health, whether it's accidents at work, having procedures in place to deal with an emergency or an environmental disaster, anything like that. Drugs and alcohol at work, those are pretty much universally covered, and I think over 85% of the codes as well. Something that on the other side of the spectrum that was a little bit surprising from our findings were the areas that weren't covered very much at all. And one of the most shocking that I found was export compliance. That was only covered in 20% of codes. And given sort of the large global nature of these companies that we looked at, I found that to be very shocking that there wasn't something mentioned in that in the code. Other things like harassment was only mentioned in 40% in the codes that we examined, and other things like data privacy was only in about 50% of the codes that we looked at. And bribery and corruption, typically the area that can cause the most headaches for company, was covered in less than 75% of the codes.
Next, you had a point which you touched on as one of the characteristics of the top 10 codes you looked at, and you really spent a lot of time talking about it. In the top 10, it was, or characteristics rather, the top 10 code, it was unambiguous reporting avenues. And in best practices, of course, you talked about that again. What do you suggest, or what did you see around reporting mechanisms in some of the codes you looked at?
Right, and really the reporting mechanisms in the supplier code are where the rubber meets the road. That's where you can get a return on investment by learning about some misconduct early and really dealing with a problem before it becomes a bigger problem, and whatever that might entail. So what we found is that 70% of the codes that we looked at did have some reporting avenues in it. The 2 most popular by far were either an email address or a phone number that someone could call, kind of a 1-800 hotline. So those are kind of the 2 most popular areas. Beyond that, some of the other avenues were just listing the company's direct phone number in the supplier code, and I did test a few of these out. I called some of the numbers, and sometimes the phone number just went to sort of the main corporate switchboard, which is, it's better than nothing, but, if someone is calling from a remote location, maybe they're not that familiar with the reporting mechanisms and how to get their call directed where it needs to go. It's there, but it may not be terribly effective. Other areas or sort of other avenues that we saw included were things like a postal address, a web hotline, where someone can go on a website and fill out a form, and then other times it was the company's website, kind of directing them to another site that might have some of those phone numbers or email addresses in there too. But 30% of the codes, again, didn't have any reporting avenues in them, and typically we recommend not 1, not 2, but 3 different reporting avenues in the code. So if someone is, a little bit more comfortable with, sending an email or a phone, maybe they're a little bit uncomfortable making a phone call because they're afraid of caller ID, they can send a letter, something like that. Just having a variety of options for people to come forward and speak up.
What did you find around the part that may seem more art than science, but generally what you've described as look and feel?
Right, and with that, I think it's something that people may scoff at and say, well, that's not really important. But at the same time, I think that it really is. It's something to take in consideration because we're all told not to judge a book by its cover, but the truth of the matter is a lot of people do, and especially people in a corporate environment where they're sort of inundated with paperwork and materials to look at. I think that you have to think about the medium being the message. So anything that can be done to make the code look a little bit more inviting, a little bit less intimidating, make it not look like a contract, have it look like a magazine, really that is going to encourage people to maybe pick it up, maybe keep it around a little bit longer on their desk, and make it a little bit more interesting and memorable too. So really the best practices that we saw were companies utilizing photographs of their products being made. Typically this is where business partners were come into play in the actual manufacture of the product. So sort of assembly lines or, parts being made, different things like that, different sort of transportation of goods and services or the actual products themselves, with the trucks or the computers or the parts or whatever it may be, photographed in the code and in nice color pictures. So really you wouldn't even have to read the code to know exactly who it's from. You can kind of see the products or the equipment or the different locations, the different offices with logos on it and things like that. Really makes the code a lot more inviting. And although it seems like something that's the least important aspect of the review, I think having a document that's approachable, that people aren't going to dismiss at first look, it can really be a powerful part of the supplier code.
That's a great insight, and I don't think something that certainly lawyers, but maybe even compliance practitioners are really focusing enough on, which is that look and feel and making it, if not friendly, certainly accessible. So with great insight. What did you find around implementation and enforcement of the supplier codes from the company down to their suppliers?
Right. That's that's a really important question in that, this is your supplier code, but, what about your suppliers and your suppliers and, and so on and so forth, because a lot of times things get subcontracted out and, where does it go down the line? We do think that it is important for companies to have a statement in their supplier code saying that, they need to communicate this code as well, or at least have the next tier suppliers act in a way that is in accordance with the hiring company's supplier code. And really we didn't find that very much in the supplier codes that we examined. I think it was in less than 20%. I think it was even less than 15% actually had something about next tier suppliers in the code itself. And that may be in a contract somewhere, or maybe in a letter of engagement, whatever it might be. It may be somewhere else, but I think that it's important to have that in the supplier code too, that is made available to the public, that an investor might look at, or a customer of the hiring company, that they can look at and know that there is that accountability down the entire supply chain too. But I think really what that brings it back to is that the supplier code, it does need to be a little bit more self-contained. With the employee code, you can have other systems in place that you keep track of and you monitor. You can force employees to take training, online or face-to-face, and you can have them sign, every employee sign a certification on the employee code. But with the supplier code, a lot of times that isn't the case. So there needs to be information in the supplier code saying that the code is a mandatory condition of doing business with the hiring company, really trying to give the supplier codes teeth, letting the suppliers know that this is a document that's real, it has consequences, and it needs to be followed if you want to continue doing business with our company.
What did you see around the areas of innovation and corporate social responsibility, or CSR?
Sure, and really we wanted to include this as part of our methodology. One, innovation in that, supplier codes, it is a fairly new thing. It's something that, again, we had to search long and deep for to find 150 codes out there, so we wanted to sort of reward some organizations that were pushing the envelope and raising the bar for other companies out there, and kind of showing that there are aspirations for going beyond just the supplier code that's a Microsoft Word document with bold and underline and no pictures and anything like that. So really, that's one side of it. We wanted to reward companies that were doing something different and innovative and coming in line with best practices. And in terms of corporate social responsibility, a lot of times I would find the supplier code in the CSR section of the website for these companies, or under sustainability. So I think in many ways the supplier code is sort of thought of a little bit as part of the CSR program, and maybe not as much as it should be as part of the compliance program. So I think that there is that need for the supplier code to again be a document that has a bit more teeth, but there is that element of CSR in the code as well. And I think that it is appropriate to mention sort of community relations when it comes to suppliers, supplier diversity, and as there is a focus on human rights in the supplier code, I think that relates back to CSR as well. So I think that there should be a flavor of CSR a little bit in the supplier code, but at the same time it is a hardline document in the document of compliance and of rigorous standards.
Were you able to come up with either any recommendations or perhaps even some future trends that you might be seeing that compliance professionals might be able to incorporate into their supplier codes of conduct?
Sure. I think that really, this relates back to sort of the hallmarks of the best codes that we've reviewed. I think that it really comes down to three things that companies could focus on to make their supplier codes a lot better. One of which is user friendliness. Having that look and feel, having a presentation that's inviting, having a code that's also easier to understand. It is written at that level of a senior in high school. People are going to be able to understand it. So I think that having that sort of user friendliness, that thought of the end users in mind, keeping in mind that it is a very diverse audience for the supplier code, that's something that needs to be taken into account in writing these for the end user and maybe not necessarily by lawyers for lawyers, as it was said earlier. The second point is to make the risk topics or the rules in the code a little bit more clear and concise. Most codes were missing risk topics that should have been there, so including those and also just expanding on ones that are a little bit more in depth. For example, covering bribery and corruption in a supplier code. It's something that everyone should do, and sometimes I would see it in the supplier code in literally one or two sentences. So it was there, but at the same time, was there enough information? Not quite. So companies need to revisit the supplier code and say, are we really covering everything that we should be covering in the code? Should we be adding more areas, maybe even removing areas that don't belong in the supplier code as well? And then lastly, I think another future trend would really be to have that implementation of the supplier code a little bit more well-defined in the organization. Certainly I understand, and you do as well, that the supplier code, it's part of a larger system. So really any supplier code, it's only as effective as it's implemented in the program. Someone can have the most well-written code, it looks fantastic, but if it just sits on a shelf somewhere and no one actually reads it, or it's not translated, it's only in English, but all the suppliers are in China, and they can't read it. It's just not a document that's useful to them. It's not really going to be a document that's effective. So I think being aware of where the supplier codes fits in the larger third-party compliance system is an important point to make, and having that reflected in the supplier code, having it be mandatory, and knowing where it fits is a part of the larger third-party compliance program.
Well, Chris, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but you mentioned one thing I wanted to specifically ask you, and you talked about that a white paper on this topic is available. That's in the middle of our interview, but I was wondering if you could give the website where anyone might who wanted to get more information could go and download the paper, and also if someone wanted to follow up with you directly, could they email you, and if so, how would they do it?
Sure. If you just go to the Red Flag Groups homepage, there's a link to it right on the homepage there. It's www.redflaggroup.com, and you can download the white paper there. It's free, so no cost involved with looking at that. And I know many of your listeners may be thinking this whole time, were we a part of it? Were we reviewed? And in that white paper, we list all of the companies that we looked at. in there, so they can see exactly if they were rated or not. And if they have not been rated and they would like to, they can always send me an email directly. My email address is Christopher, that's just the traditional spelling on Christopher, .Sindik, SINDIK, at redflaggroup.com. I'm happy to talk supplier codes, as you know, Tom. If anyone wants me to kind of give their code of conduct a quick look over or discuss it with them in more in depth, I'd be happy to do that.
It's a great offer, and anyone out there, I have heard Chris talk. He knows this stuff inside and out, and if it's something that you're considering or want to take a look at, he's the guy to do it for you. So I hope you'll give him a shout or shoot him an email. Chris, I want to thank you again for not only coming on the podcast, but frankly for this work. You've really led the discussion in an area that many compliance practitioners haven't thought about. They certainly, if they have thought about it, not to the detail you have. So I look forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Likewise, Tom.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to episode 185 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you today. If you could go to iTunes and rate this podcast, I would appreciate it. Also, if you have any questions that you'd like answered in an upcoming mailbag episode, please email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I really appreciate you listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again. Thank you.